We're back with Chapter 10, the attrition factor. As Israel's Givati Brigade concluded its decimation of Quza'ah and made plans to advance on Rafah, the Qassam brigades initiated a new wave of surprise attacks. On July 28th, Qassam fighters launched a mortar strike at a rallying point of Israeli soldiers across the Gaza boundary. The following day, Qassam's media arm posted one of the most stunning videos of the 51-day war, and footage apparently captured with a GoPro camera affixed to a Qassam fighter's helmet the day before. 9 guerrillas are seen emerging from a tunnel at Israel's Nahal Oz crossing and rushing through a thicket of brush towards a military base. A group bursts into heavily fortified bases. The group bursts into a heavily fortified base and easily overpowers Israeli soldiers, who appear to be helpless in close quarters combat. One Israeli soldier who attempts to resist is quickly overpowered and shot at close range by fighters who sprint from the base with his Tavor standard issue rifle in hand. They then retreat back to Gaza through the same tunnel shaft with only one dead. 5 Israeli soldiers were killed in the incident, according to the Israeli military, but the number may have been higher than the army revealed. The following day, the Israeli army spokesperson unit attempted to cover up the embarrassment on the battlefield. It claimed in a statement to the media that the soldiers had been killed in a single RPG strike, then insisted that the soldiers had successfully stopped a planned Qassam brigade attack on civilians living in the adjacent Nahal Oz kibbutz. Both claims were proven false, and the veracity of the video confirmed. As Haaretz correspondent Chaim Levinson and Amos Harel wrote, quote, "The Hamas men did not kill the soldiers from a distance, but entered the compound and shot them at close range. No firing of a rocket-propelled grenade can be seen at all. It's also clear that the militants had planned to storm the position from the start and were not en route to the nearby kibbutz to massacre civilians," end quote. The casualty count at this point in the war gave new urgency to the strategy of Qassam Brigade's commander Muhammad al-Daif, the casualty count at this point in the war gave new urgency to the strategy Qassam Brigade's commander Mohammed al-Daif had overseen. By August 3rd, just after the Israeli army enacted the Hannibal Directive in Rafah, the Israeli death toll stood just over 67, almost exclusively soldiers and military personnel. Meanwhile, the Israeli army had killed more than 1,800 residents of Gaza, among whom 80% were civilians. According to estimates by the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs and the Al-Mazan Center for Human Rights. While Al-Qassam aimed to kill soldiers in close quarters engagements, the Israeli army had resorted to the Dihya doctrine, employing disproportionate force to battle Gaza's civilian population in vain hopes that they would turn on Hamas. On July 30th, the former president, Shimon Peres, visited troops wounded in Gaza at an Israeli hospital. He was moved to concede that the ground invasion had, quote, exhausted itself, and, quote, now we have to find a way to stop it, end quote. Nahum Barnea, a widely read liberal Israeli columnist for Yedoth Aronoth, a winner of the nationally esteemed Israeli Prize for Cultural Accomplishment, noted the scowling and grief-stricken expressions that washed the faces of Netanyahu and Army Chief of Staff Benny Gantz during their press conference about the attacks on Nahal Oz. Quote, "From the first day of the operation, we have been dragged and we are still being dragged," end quote. Bernea wrote, quote, "Hamas is dictating the extent and the length of the conflict, and our forces have not found a move, an initiative, or a patent to break this dictation," end quote. The Nahal Oz raid reinforced a long-standing criticism that the Israeli army had badly atrophied after decades of policing an occupied, largely defenseless population. Just as the army was routed during its ground invasions of southern Lebanon in 2006, it had proven incapable of defeating armed factions in Gaza whose firepower was only a shadow of Hezbollah's. Quote, "We have been to a number of rallying points and were amazed to discover that the lessons of the Second Lebanon War and the military escalation in 2012 had not been implemented. End quote. A soldier complained to the Israeli paper Yedoth Aronoth about the deadly mortar attack on July 28th. Another soldier remarked that the army had been, quote, punched hard in the gut by the Qassam brigades. As the war entered its fourth week, Netanyahu, Defense Minister Moshe Ya'alon, and their kitchen cabinet of military and political advisors seemed determined to resist calls from right-wing members of Likud and Foreign Minister Lieberman to expand the ground invasion and move towards a full occupation of the Gaza Strip. On July 31st, Netanyahu, Ya'alon, and Army Chief of Staff Benny Gantz gathered cabinet ministers representing mostly right-wing parties from the governing coalition for what one minister described as a, quote, intimidation meeting, end quote. In the closed briefing, army officials warned ministers that reoccupying Gaza would cost Israel a devastating price in blood and treasure, conjuring memories of the German siege of Stalingrad. Quote, at that meeting, they described to us scenarios that seemed like they were taken from World War II, end quote. One minister who attended the meeting recalled, though the Israeli army's ground war had exhausted itself, the fighting was far from over. Not only was Netanyahu determined to deprive Hamas of claiming significant wartime accomplishments, but the U.S. and Israel's chosen intermediaries in negotiations with Hamas, the Egyptian military junta, was determined to keep Gaza in a vice for as long as Hamas remained in power. Nothing but a reentrenchment of the status quo and a tightening of the siege would satisfy Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi and his generals, who viewed Hamas as the devious cousin of their internal nemesis, the Muslim Brotherhood. It was unthinkable that any deal that the regime put forward would offer Hamas the humanitarian concessions it had demanded at the onset of hostilities. On July 29th, the day Qassam released the videos of the Nahal Oz raid, Al-Qassam Brigade's General Commander Mohammed El-Deif addressed the public. The faceless figure known around Gaza as, quote, the Phantom, had not been heard from since Operation Cast Lead in January 2009. With his refusal to engage in politics and unswerving belief in armed resistance as a means to dislodge Israel's occupation, Deif's street credibility was indisputable. As a seasoned tactician and war veteran, he was as influential as anyone among the political leadership of Hamas, with enough power to veto a ceasefire deal. Speaking for 4 minutes in a subdued, almost atonal voice, Deif set out to affirm the justice of Qassam's tactics, targeting military personnel and bases against those of the Israelis who had aimed the brunt of their force against Gaza's civilians. He declared, quote, we have prioritized confronting and killing the military and the soldiers at the checkpoints over the attacking civilians at a time when the criminal enemy wades in civilian blood and commits massacres and brings down the roofs of homes on the top of the heads of their inhabitants. The more they attack the civilians, the more justified it becomes for us to kill their soldiers, end quote. Deif rejected out of hand any deal that failed to satisfy the demands first outlined by Hamas. At the onset of the war, quote, the usurping entity will not enjoy security as long as our people do not enjoy it and do not live with freedom and dignity, he stated, quote, and there will be no ceasefire unless the aggression stops and the siege is lifted. And we will not accept any compromise that come at the expense of the dignity and freedom of our people, end quote. The guerrilla commander seemed to have aimed this part of his message as much at the Israelis as the Palestinian negotiators in Cairo, cautioning them against accepting a bargain that wasted the achievements he believed his forces had made on the battlefield. Gonna have a quick drink. This guy's something else, huh? Though he did not say so explicitly, Deif seemed to sense that the war was entering a new phase. He described the ground invasion as a boondoggle, quote, where Israel seems to be sending in its soldiers to die, end quote, suggesting that al-Qassam was ready for a long war against the enemy with every mode of destruction at its disposal. Quote, we confirm our preparedness for a long war and are working based on previously planned out strategies, he said. Deif's confidence irked Yair Lapid, the finance minister, and center-right Yesh Atid party leader. Quote, for years, Mohammed Deif has been hiding in the tunnels underneath Gaza, and that is where he will remain because he is a dead man. Quote, end quote. Lapid, a veteran broadcast personality and former Hollywood studio executive, rumbled. By the first week of August, Israeli military morale was at a low ebb, but it maintained a decisive edge in diplomatic support and sheer firepower. In his public statements, President Barack Obama expressed compassion for the devastated population of Gaza, stating in an August 1st press conference that the images of children torn to pieces by Israeli shrapnel were heartbreaking. However, the president placed blame entirely on Hamas for the civilian casualties, claiming that Hamas was, quote, housing these rocket launchers right in the middle of civilian neighborhoods, end quote. Obama went on to declare that, quote, Israel has a right to defend itself and it's got to be able to get those rockets and those tunnel networks, end quote. He seemed to have heeded the warning from Netanyahu, who after the collapse of the August 1st ceasefire had told U.S. Ambassador to Israel Dan Shapiro that the Obama administration was, quote, not to ever second guess me again on Hamas, end quote. The al-Qassam brigades had, in fact, launched rockets within close proximity of civilian areas, but not necessarily because it sought to cover among civilians. The Gaza Strip is one of the most densely populated places on Earth, packed with refugees and devoid of open space, leaving guerrilla groups with little choice but to operate from within an urban maze. Al-Qassam was an underground operation in the most literal sense of the term. Its fighters spent much of the war in tunnels, separated from the civilian population, and often launched mortars and rockets from tunnel shafts. Few civilians I interviewed in Gaza had seen any fighters operating openly in their neighborhoods during the war. However, several residents of Shujaiya described to me as having witnessed al-Qassam fighters help evacuate residents during a ceasefire. Their accounts contradicted those of the Israeli military, which claimed Hamas had ordered residents to stay in their homes ahead of the ground invasion. On July 29th, UNRWA inspectors found a cache of rockets in an empty school that had been closed for the summer. It was the third documented incident of rockets found in an empty school during the months of July. In most cases, when the Israeli military claimed to be targeting civilian sites housing weapons, however, independent investigators like Amnesty International could not find any confirmation, even as Amnesty prepared a report accusing Palestinian armed factions of, quote, war crimes for firing rockets indiscriminately into Israel. While Obama chastised Palestinian armed groups, he helped replenish Israel's supply of munitions after it exhausted them on the civilian areas in Gaza. The most critical delivery of U.S. weapons to Israel took place on July 20th, just a day before the Battle of Shujaiya, that saw 11 Israeli artillery divisions reduce the eastern Gaza neighborhood to rubble. When the Pentagon to allow Israel to dip into the stockpile of more than $1 billion of arms the U.S. maintained in the country. The weapons transfer included all of the 40mm grenade launchers, the 155mm Horowitz rounds, the 155 Horowitz rounds the Israeli military needed to continue its assault without interruption. Back in Jerusalem, Economics Minister Naftali Bennett of the far-right Jewish Home Party leveraged the war in Gaza to make a power play against Netanyahu. He revealed to the Israeli media that he had made direct contact with the commanders in the field to help them coordinate its campaign against Gaza's tunnel network. Rumors circulated that Bennett's liaison to the frontline troops was Avichai Ronsky. Avichai Ronsky, the former chief military rabbi of the Israeli army who served as the spiritual guide of Bennett's party and maintained close ties to religious nationalist soldiers. Bennett also disclosed that he had pressed Netanyahu for a ground invasion of Gaza immediately after discovering the bodies of 3 kidnapped Israeli teens in the West Bank in early July. Ronsky, who had reportedly donned the Israeli army garb, insinuated himself among the combat units in Gaza despite not having been called up for duty, was promptly dismissed from the army reserves. He denied any wrongdoing. Defense Minister Ya'alon, one of Netanyahu's closest allies in the government, was furious that a junior minister from a competing party had circumvented his authority and publicly undercut him. Quote, "That is unacceptable," end quote. The defense minister raged 2 months later, quote, "It is legitimate for a politician to form direct ties with army officers and, based on that, tried to manipulate the chief of staff and the cabinet and say that he's a lazy horse compared to the galloping horses, the officers in the field, question mark, end quote, taking credit for supposed actions against Gaza's tunnel network. Bennett hammered Netanyahu and his allies for their refusal to march on Gaza City. His behavior recalled the part played by Ariel Sharon in the early 1980s, when the gung-ho right-wing Minister of Defense drummed up pressure on Likud Prime Minister Menachem Begin to take Beirut from the People's Liberation, from the PLO. Without outlining a possible strategy to reoccupy Gaza, Bennett bellowed out populist bluster. Quote, "Hit Hamas without mercy, day and night, on weekdays and holidays, without respite and without rest, until they are defeated," end quote. Getting a lot of messages right now. No matter how long the war lasted, Bennett demanded its prosecution until Hamas was finished. Quote, "If it takes a month, we'll take it. If we need a year to work in the border areas, we will ask for it and get it. If we need freedom from IDF operations in Gaza, in the Gaza Strip indefinitely, then we will ask for it and get it," end quote, Bennett declared. With his incessant calls for total war, Bennett successfully enhanced his political standing before the right-wing trending Israeli youth who identified with him as, quote, "Brother Naftali." But it was Netanyahu and his inner circle who would bear the responsibility for the outcome of the fighting. With control of the skies, the Israeli military pressed ahead with the bombing campaign that targeted civilian homes, factories, and infrastructure. It aimed to fulfill the, quote, "disproportionate force" doctrine drawn up by military advisors in 2008 that called for, quote, "inflicting damage and meting out punishment to an extent that will demand long and expensive reconstruction process," end quote. As ground troops were pulled from Gaza, the lawn mowing continued. That was chapter 10. I'm going to shut the stream off, turn it right back on so we can separate these segments so people have an easier time listening to them in the future or whatever, studying them, that kind of thing. So we will be right back. And I apologize for the delay.